Welcome back to the Munn Avenue Muse podcast, which is a production of MunnAvenuePress.com. We are the publisher of both fiction and nonfiction books. We worked with over 40 authors in 6 countries last year, and we have a wonderful team of people. And one of our exciting new authors is a guest today on our podcast and video cast, Jim Kleiger. So I'll just give you a very brief bio, and then we'll learn more about Jim when we have our little conversation here. So Jim is the author of the novel, The 11th Inkblot, and his new novel, which we had the honor to publish, is called Tears Are Only Water. That's a pretty provocative title, Jim. So you're going to have to explain that. Jim was a senior psychologist and psychoanalyst. He's published 6 professional nonfiction books on the Rorschach Test, psychoses, and bipolar disorders. So I'm really anxious to hear about how your psychology background informs your fiction writing, Jim. Why don't you start us off and talk about your psychology background first? I'm really interested to hear more about that, where that interest came from, and what kind of things did you do?
We're going back a long ways. Well, I've been a clinical psychologist for 45 years, and then did my psychoanalytic training, which is an advanced level of practice, probably about 25 years ago. And over the course of my career, I've done a lot of primarily clinical work in the form of psychotherapy with kids, teenagers, and adults. And then I've done psychoanalysis, which again is a specialized form of intensive therapy, which I don't do anymore. I don't do that much therapy anymore. I have a couple people that I work with. But primarily over the last, really the span of my career, but a lot in the last I say principally in the last 10 to 15 years, has been conducting psychological and neuropsychological evaluations. Somebody comes in with some problems, some symptoms, problems in adjustment in school and relationships, and they want to learn more about it. Usually this is a referral by a clinician, or sometimes the school. And so I, in addition to gathering a lot of information and doing a lot of interviews with parents, with the individual themselves, I'll do a variety of different sorts of testing measures.
Well, you are really an expert in the Rorschach test. Is that correct?
The Rorschach. In fact, that's a kind of a subplot in the 11th Inkblot, where the character ends up. This is back in World War I. It takes place in Eastern Europe in World War I. The 11th Inkblot is a historical novel, and it has a fictionalized relationship between my central character, Anton Zelinsky, and Hermann Rorschach, the Swiss psychiatrist who pioneered the Inkblot test, the Rorschach test.
Yeah, and for those who, it's interesting because I was aware of it. I had taken some psychology courses and such, but I mentioned this to a couple of people, and they didn't know what a Rorschach test was. So can you explain,
sure,
for those who might not know what it is and how you use it?
So the title, The 11th Inkblot, is, I mean, somebody might wonder why 11? Where does that come from? There's 10 inkblots. When Hermann Rorschach in the 1920 vintage developed this test, he had probably created about 40 or so inkblots. And the inkblots were made in the conventional manner where you drop ink on a page and fold it, except Rorschach did a lot more editing and kind of artistic manipulation to get the blots so that they were sufficiently ambiguous, but also suggestive, full of contradictions. And anyway, since that time, there have been 10 inkblots, and so the 11th inkblot was a bit of a play on that.
So were the 10 like the 10 standard inkblots?
10 standard inkblots, okay. Yeah. And it's really a test of, it used to be thought of as a test of the unconscious, which it's really not. It was thought, described as a projective test where the individual is projecting his or her kind of psychological issues, internal world onto this amorphous kind of nondescript inkblot. And it's really more than that. It's a test where somebody actually shows us how they think, how they process information, how they put together ideas, how they organize and observe. And there's been the instrument has been revised, developed, heavily researched so that we know that certain patterns of how somebody responds to the blot, not so much what they see, although what they see in the blot is important, but the way they go about formulating a response tells us a lot about an individual's thinking and reasoning, their emotional experiences, internal relational capacities. So it's very different from the kinds of procedures that are based on asking somebody direct questions, either in an interview or.
What attracted you to this, Jim? Why did that resonate with you?
Gosh, that's a good question, and I know when I was first introduced to it in graduate school, and I think part of it is clearly the influence of some early mentors. Although the Rorschach is not based on psychoanalytic theory, it really invites one to kind of look deeply, and I think that was appealing to me. It was not kind of surface level, questionnaire-based, self-report-based. It really gave us an opportunity to understand what somebody couldn't tell us. And that was appealing to me as a way of understanding people at a deeper level.
So it could help reveal some emotion or maybe trauma or something that they were having difficulty verbalizing or
right.
Right. No, that's very interesting.
And it's really one of the ways that it's been primarily demonstrated to be useful is in understanding the difficulties that people have with thinking and reasoning.
Right. So
because what you're doing is you're presenting somebody with a pretty unstructured, open-ended task. And it's sort of like you hand somebody an inkblot and you say, what might this be? Which is a standard instruction.
Sure.
And I'm not giving you any more to go on in that than that. So
right. So it triggers the kind of conversation or sharing in a different way.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, so you wrote several books on that topic. What led you or inspired you to start writing fiction?
When I wrote my first book in 1999, it was called Disordered Thinking and the Rorschach. And I kind of out of the blue, and I don't know what prompted it, I thought that someday I'd like to write a story about an 11th Inkblot. There was something about that title, and again, it's sort of inside baseball.
Right.
Like I explained before, there's 10 Inkblots, only
Right.
10. But I thought, man, it would be kind of cool to imagine a story about the 11th Inkblot. Would it be a mystery where somebody goes to Vienna or Switzerland and discovers during, Nazi Germany a hidden 11th Inkblot? So that idea sort of circulating around that for me was a provocative title. Kind of stayed in my preconscious for 25 years. And life continued. I had kids. I was devoted to my career, writing articles, doing workshops, and other books. But that idea kind of lodged in my mind. I had a friend who's a novelist, and I remember one day sitting down with him and saying, I've got this idea. And by that time, the idea had really changed a lot from these early imaginings. So that was like 2019, and I set out to writing it, which I did, and discovered a deep kind of pleasure that I hadn't quite experienced in writing textbooks, which I enjoy, or writing lengthy psychological testing reports, which I kind of enjoy. I mean, that's real work. But there's something about the creative process that was just kind of a wonderful world opening.
And have you found?
Well, you know that.
Sure. Well, yeah, I've written several 6 books myself, and I write. They're all fiction based on something real, like your ink blots. In my case, it's technology. But I found it surprising when I started writing fiction after I would come up with some character or some odd situation, and at the end of a writing session say, oh, where did that come from? And realize that it was somewhere deep inside my unconscious or subconscious. Have you had that experience?
Oh, I mean, I'm reacting in a powerful way to that, because it's exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, there's people refer to that as unconscious writing, a phenomenon that authors experience. So what you're describing about, I mean, I have a lot of different metaphors or visual images for this. I'm not the writer, and I don't know. You seem to me to be have a quite organized mind. So when you write your books, I imagine that you are a plotter, that you have an organized approach to structuring your story. I haven't had as much of that. I've had an idea, and often, like I said with the 11th Inkblot, it was just the provocative title. Tears Are Only Water, it was an encounter that occurs early in the book. And so I get inspired to tell a story about that and have kind of maybe data points. But when I start writing, I really don't quite know where it's going to take me. And I end up being surprised, sometimes frustrated, but for me, it's sort of like driving in the dark, and my headlights are illuminating a road, and I just don't know where the turns are, but I'm kind of going along with it. And then there's this frustrating time that comes where all of a sudden the road runs out and I have to leave it and do other things and try not to engage in too much avoidance. That fretful feeling of I don't know where I'm going. So actually with the current, the sequel that I'm writing to Tears Are Only Water, I had reached that point where I feverishly just kind of allowed my unconscious to dictate to me all this dialogue and cool stuff. I think it's cool. I'll read it later and think, oh my God, this is terrible. I've got to edit this. But anyway, so I ran out of road and then sort of forced myself to get back to it, and was delighted where this it's sort of like I ended up at a point where I hadn't envisioned it. It just worked really well.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you talk about your process, because besides being a writer and a publisher, I'm a real student of the process. And different authors have different methods of outlining and preparing to write, right? So you said you thought I was organized, but in my first book, like you, all I did was had an idea. I read an article about how Google was working on a method to, in effect, digitize your brain and upload it to the cloud so you could live virtually forever. They were investing billions of dollars in this. And I thought, what could go wrong with that? And that was the seed of my whole first book. And
I love it.
I sat down with a blank page and just started writing.
I love it. Yeah.
And I ran out of road. My analogy was I painted myself into a corner.
Into a corner. Yeah.
Right. And I had to figure out how to get out. Ann Patchett professed that this was really a good thing because, like, you're going down a blind road. She said, if you don't know where you're going, neither will the reader. So it's an exciting adventure for them. But every year I go to a conference in New York, which is fabulous, called Thriller Fest, and all the top thriller writers are there. So I've heard many of them speak. And they have different outlining techniques. So I tried them for my second, third, and fourth book. So for my second book, David Morrell, who many people don't know his name, but they know his character. He was the father and inventor of Rambo, and a great writer. Even though you think of his movies as, oh, it's a Sylvester Stallone action movie. No, his writing is terrific. And what he does is he writes himself a letter, and he says, "Dear David, I have this idea for a book, and it involves such and such characters and such situations and blah, 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 blah." And he ends it with, "Well, what do you think of that idea?" And if he likes the idea, he's got an outline, because this letter is usually 25 pages long. So when I started my second book, I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I'll try that. I think I got 15 pages into it, and I just was so anxious to start writing that I put it aside and started writing.
That's a great idea.
And then my third one, I guess, was I also heard like C.J. Box, who's a famous writer and multiple TV series. And what he does is he writes 100-page outline that's quite detailed, and then he writes his book on top of the outline. He's sort of half written it. So for my third book, I wrote a very long outline, and I even did this huge poster with Post-it notes for the scenes and all. And my motivation there was, I thought, if I really outline thoroughly, maybe I can write the book faster. That really didn't happen.
Yeah.
So for my fourth book, I went back to my original technique.
Yeah.
Like yours. I had an idea.
Yeah.
And I just went with where it went. And I think I think it turned out quite well.
Yeah.
The only odd comment I had on the fourth book was I had a reader that I run into him like once a year. He always bugs me, "Where's the next book?" And then he said, your fourth book, did you write that? And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Yeah, of course I wrote it." He said, "I didn't use AI. I actually wrote the book." And I said, "Well," I said, "people are telling me that, it's better." And he says, "Yeah, I love the book, but it just didn't sound like you." But I think what happens is and you probably experience this,
Oh, yeah.
your voice changes, and also you get better at it.
You get better at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I wrote the 11th Inkblot, I'd done a lot of writing, but not creative writing, and, and writing dialogue, writing in a close psychic distance, really understanding anything about the process. I just wrote it and was also very impatient about publishing it when the process and the timeline for Tears Are Only Water was much, much longer. And I devoted a lot of time. I got an editor and worked with you and kind of slowed the process down, did a lot of rewriting and so forth. So,
Yeah, which makes it better.
yeah.
And it's another interesting thing that I think is probably true of you is when I wrote Not So Dead, which is my first book,
That's
I wrote what I knew. I knew a lot of the background stuff, just like you are very familiar with ink blots and the psychology behind it. Um, and there are people who said, "Oh, write what you know." Okay, well, that's good for one book, but um, what Ann Patchett also said is, "I like to write what I want to know." So what I
ah,
found with my second book is I interviewed a lot of experts, and actually a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a karate expert, a chemical weapons expert. I spent a day with the ATF,
wow.
and that was so much fun. But I learned a lot about what I didn't know. So you find now that you've written a second and working on a third book that you're expanding your knowledge base for this.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's admittedly it's kind of thin. Like I write in the 11th Inkblot, I wrote a lot about World War One, and I did a lot of research on it. But I'm certainly not conversant as one who has devoted lots of time to studying World War One. I wrote a lot about vintage Swiss watches. I have a personal connection to that, a family connection, and I did a lot of research there. I wrote about the Romani culture. So there were all these areas I didn't know anything about. In Tears Are Only Water, there was also there's a big spiritual component with the Navajo indigenous culture of spiritual healing and so forth. So I had to do a deep dive into that. A lot of mathematics, sort of obscure, arcane mathematical formulas and mysteries, and people say, "Man, you know a lot about that," and I always have at the end acknowledgments which basically say, "No, I don't. I used these sources. I had some wonderful human sources for Tears Are Only Water. Somebody who became such a nice friend, a professor at Kansas State University who is indigenous and was very, very helpful."
Yeah, yeah. So
So
yeah, so you did it. You really did expand your world there.
right.
Is there a short passage from Tears Are Only Water that you might be willing to read or share with
Sure,
us?
sure. Can I put it in some context?
Sure,
Just
please
just to
do.
sort of
Yeah, let us know where we're at.
the book itself is a bit of a cautionary tale on the problems that arise when people don't deal with loss and trauma in their lives, and it's told through the eyes of three characters, each of whom is struggling with unrecognized or denied trauma. And the principal character, whose name is Carmine, is a neurodiverse man in his mid-20s, painfully shy, suffers severe narcolepsy, has a stutter, and can only work sort of as a low-level bookkeeper. In fact, that's how he's sort of referred to in the early parts of the book, the bookkeeper, because he's got this severe narcolepsy. One night, he's working at night, and he's visited by a woman from his past whom he was in love with, and it was an unrequited relationship. And she came to deliver some vital information, and then she disappeared. So there's a mystery afoot at that point about who is this person. So the passage that I selected really, her name is, Carmine refers to her as E, just the letter E. And Carmine is a mathematical savant.
Okay.
He's basically hidden from his unrecognized trauma by burying himself in obscure mathematics. So this passage, 2 paragraphs, tell a bit about how they met. She found him at the 10th grade science fair. E, a straight A student, destined to become valedictorian, and he, the nerdy math geek who couldn't string together more than 2 words or look at anyone in the eye. How 2 souls from different planets became friends was the 8th wonder of the world. But unfortunately, his mother and sister Anne were convinced that E saw him nothing more as a novelty, her own personal elephant man. Anne harangued him. "Can't you see? You're the community service project she'll write about in her college essays. She cares nothing about you. Wake up, brother." Back then, no one understood why a girl with her spectrum of luminous colors, classic bone structure, athletic talents, and brains had given a boy with his spectrum of oddities a second look. E quickly became popular, and when her friends mocked the size of Carmine's ears or his taped-together glasses, she silenced them with a glare. She routinely joined him at lunch or sought him out in class. Among her myriad talents, E had a scientifically curious mind and was bewitched by his facility with numbers and his description of the shapes and colors he saw when he recited pi up to the 300th digit. They sat together silently during study hall, reading and researching genetics theory, her passion, and mathematical mysteries, his. When they did speak, it was usually about mapping the genome, solving exponential equations, or memorizing mathematical constants. He hoped she enjoyed the quiet when they sat together and liked being with someone different from her other friends. One day he asked, "Why me? I don't get it. That's all." He smiled and said, "Oh, Carm, most kids are posers and ignoramusaurs. You're different. I like that about you. Can you really see colors and numbers?"
Great. Oh, that's
he's a synesthetic.
Yeah.
He has narcolepsy, and it's never quite made explicit whether he's on the spectrum. But anyway.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. I mean, if you're listening there and you're as entranced and intrigued by what you just heard, Tears Are Only Water and the 11th Inkblot are available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com, and you can order them from local bookstores. And I didn't mean to inject a commercial right at that point, but I'm taken with your book and your writing, Jim. So I think and just the first time actually I've asked somebody to read a passage because I just love your writing.
Well, I appreciate that.
Now, having gone through this process, is there any any advice that you would like to share with authors that are writing their first book or in the middle of writing, or what did you learn along the way that you think would help others?
Well, it is helpful to increase your knowledge base by joining a group and taking some courses. There's, I guess, a lot of different writing organizations, but I happened to land upon one called Jericho Writers, which is based in the UK. I've been a member probably since 2020 and took a self-editing course, and then subsequently used the the lead instructor as the editor for Tears Are Only Water. Learned a tremendous amount, took a lot of webinars, did a lot of reading, did another class on self-publishing. So I think it really, if you're interested in this, I think affiliating, finding a community. I don't really have time to take advantage of all of the stuff that Jericho Writers offers, but they really, it's a bargain, and so I think something like that. So have a community, study the craft, and read. Obviously, read. Find your favorite authors and try to emulate them, and be humble that you'll never reach that level. But
you can't find you can't really be a serious writer unless you like to read.
Yeah.
That's not, you've got to like to read and want to read. And I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No.
But, and the other thing about groups is like almost everywhere there's a local writers group. I belong to a writers group near me, and we meet every month, and we're all writing, so we critique each other's latest chapter in a very supportive but honest way, and it works. You need that feedback as a writer. It's not something that you can like do in a silo and say it's great and I'm done. You need a good editor. You need a proofreader.
Yeah.
You need, if you can find them, beta readers. I have a group of people that will read my latest book when it's 95% done, and then with the feedback you rewrite. It's funny, when I was writing my first book, and I was about 3/4 of the way through, and it seemed like a real slog to do it. It took me years to get the first one done, and the rest were fast. I was met John Sanford, who's a best-selling thriller author, and he was talking about his editing process. And he said, after I finish writing the book, I usually take about 6 months, and I must go through the entire book 15 to 20 times. And I'm sitting there trying to finish my first book, and I'm going, oh my God, 15 to 20 times. You got to be kidding me. Well, by the time I was done, it was 15 to 20 times, right? Between rewrites, your copy editor sends you comments, you do more changes, you proof it, you reread it. So I don't think readers appreciate how much work goes into creating a good to great book.
There's a fun, probably cliche about writing and editing, which is that you write drunk and edit sober.
Hemingway
and I think,
supposedly said that.
Did Hemingway say that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's truth in that, at least in a metaphorical way. We all write with a passion and have this sense that this is so wonderful, and then either go back and read it or share it with somebody and realize that you were sort of entertaining yourself, and it needs a lot of work. So
yeah. Well, also, when you're finished writing that first draft, it's a good idea to put it down and walk away from it for a couple of weeks.
Right.
And come back with fresh eyes.
Right.
So that you can see it at least a little objectively anyway. So just curious, Jim, what are you reading now? What books are on your nightstand?
I'm currently reading Barbara Quicksilver's Demon Copperhead, and I finished Abraham Verghese's Covenant of Water. Now, if I have a couple heroes as a 72-year-old man, Abraham Verghese is one of them.
And why is that?
Well, he's a physician I don't know if he's retired. I imagine he still practices. So he wrote Cutting for Stone and The Covenant of Water, and there's a lot of medical stuff. He's used a lot of his medical novel. He's a wonderful writer. He expresses himself so beautifully in prose that it's really poetry to listen to him. He seems very soulful. He did an interview on Sunday Morning a couple weeks ago, and I mean, he's just so humble and, charismatic in his humility. And again, he just writes beautifully, very moving. Now, he did something that kind of intrigued me, and I don't know if it it intrigued me. I don't know if there's anything practical in it. He said he retired from his practice. I guess he consults now or something, and he went for about, was it 3 weeks to the University of Iowa for the writer's workshop. And that kind of appealed to me as something I might like to do. But
well, being a student, continuing to study is I think so important to just about any pursuit that you do. I'm an avid student of whatever I pursue. And it's interesting because I can think of a few doctors that have become great writers. Probably my favorite is Michael Crichton.
Right.
Because that's my style. But there's this Michael Palmer who wrote like 40 books, and Robin Cook was another one that seems like doctors and lawyers have a lot to say.
I have a colleague whom I met about 5 months ago, who's an English professor, and he's also trained as a psychoanalyst, although he's not a practitioner. But he's written several books, the latest of which he's finishing is Psychoanalysts Who Write Fiction. And I was honored that one of his chapters is on the 11th Inkblot.
Oh, neat.
And he does a deep dive into the author's stories and tries to look for links to their own lives and so forth. And I got to know him. In fact, he did a blurb for Tears Are Only Water. But there's I guess not a lot of like psychoanalysts end up writing fiction. I think some do it more towards the end of their careers, which is true for me, where people feel a little bit freer to not be so anonymous. And
I also think it helps in writing fiction in particular to have a lifetime full of experiences to draw from.
Yeah.
I have a writer friend in my writers group who's in his 80s, and I think he didn't start writing till he was 75. And he says often, "Oh, I wish I had started doing this sooner." And I say no, not for me. Because I think if you start when you're younger, you don't have the wealth of experience to draw from.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, 10 years ago was just the right time to start writing.
Yeah.
But you do need to have a clear head to do it. I mean, if you're working an intense job, it can be hard, but I have another friend who works in bank security, and he does all his writing on the weekends, full out on the weekends, because during the week he just can't, he can't have a clear head to do it. Well, that's neat. Well, Jim, this has been such a pleasure to have you share your thoughts and your background, and I highly recommend Tears Are Only Water and the 11th Inkblot, which you can get on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. All the books we publish can be ordered through your local bookstores. And it's a great read. And if you are an author with a book or an idea and want some help publishing and marketing that book, check out the monavenuepress.com. And in between sharing these podcast episodes, we issue a newsletter every week on Substack. And this will be on YouTube and Spotify and Apple podcasts. So if you do hear or listen, please subscribe if you want to hear more. And if you have friends who might be interested, please share it with them. And I looked at this venture of ours as, not only being directed towards authors and writers, but avid readers who, like me, I'd like to hear the backstory, of, well, how did you do that? How did you create that? What inspired you to do that? So keep tuning into the Mun Avenue Muse from monavenuepress.com, and we'll see you next time.
Can I just add very quickly that I was eager to accept your invitation to do this because I have profited from my professional relationship with you. You were so incredibly helpful for my first time self-publishing. I published the 11th Inkblot in a different venue, but you were so helpful. And, you and Rachel Thompson and Steve Bennett, kind of a axis of helpful facilitators. And anyway, I was very happy to do this because you've been so helpful to me.
Oh, it was a pleasure working with you, Jim. And I'll just mention that you mentioned him. Steve Bennett builds websites focused solely on authors. I think they've done 900 websites by now.
Yeah.
And he's at authorbytes.com. That's authorbytes.com. And Rachel does social media, and she is badredheadmedia.com. So if you need help in that area, please check out my friends.
Great. She's great.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Jim.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Take care.